And now, in the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, I've been introduced by Jim Henderson.
Thank you.
It's only truth. So I do want to talk about New Orleans racing, because in the antebellum period, the South was where the greatest racing in America was, and New Orleans was where the greatest racing in the South was. And that's a really glamorous, exciting story, and I'm excited to tell it. But the other story that I want to tell is, as Jim was explaining to you, it's often a forgotten story or an erased story. And that's a story about the black men who were integral to that sport for centuries before the coming of Jim Crow, and how important their contributions were, not just to the sport, but in fact to the sort of larger national history of 19th century America and of the transition between slavery and freedom. So let's start with probably the most important race in the history of New Orleans, and that's the Great Post Stakes in 1854, and the Metairie Course, which, as you know, is now where the cemetery is, had decided that they, as the sort of most glamorous, highest stakes track in the country, were going to have sort of a national championship event. And they proposed that each state would be allowed to nominate one horse and put money into a sort of collected pot so they could have a record-breaking purse. And in the end, only 4 states sent horses, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. But in those days, that was really all you needed to have a top-class contest. And it was a big deal. The national newspapers reported on it. People came from all over America. There was speculation that about $1 million would probably be bet on the outcome. I did the conversion. That's over $30 billion today. And the day of the race, the newspaper said town was just dead. Everybody who was anybody had gone down there. All kinds of prominent visitors. Millard Fillmore, who was, filling time because he wasn't president anymore, had decided to come to the track. And in those days, top-class racing was done in heats, so it was best of 3. And really, really high-class racehorses ran 4 miles. So in a best of 3 heat race, a horse might run 12 miles. On that day, it only needed 2 heats for the Kentucky entry, that's Lexington, to win. And Lexington would actually go on to become one of the most famous thoroughbred sires in history. His skeleton was for many, many years in the Smithsonian. And if you want to see it now, it's on permanent loan to the International Museum of the Horse. But Lexington's closest competitor was a horse who had been bred in Louisiana, in Rapides Parish, in fact, whose name was LaCount. And LaCount belonged to a planter named Thomas Jefferson Wells, who had named the horse for a friend of his. The town is actually named for the horse. And LaCount had been competitive, and he'd been competitive enough to where Wells said he wanted a rematch. And there was some debate back and forth, but in about 2 weeks, Lexington and LaCount went at it again. And let me tell you, this caused a big stir. Let me read to you from the Times, well, it's the Picayune at the time. Lexington and LaCount were the great lions of the day, and bulletins from their respective stables were waited for and read with the same interest and avidity as though they announced the possible change of a dynasty or the probable fate of a nation. And in that rematch, LaCount not only defeated Lexington, he smashed the American record for 4 miles by about 10 seconds. His jockey actually had him so far in front at the end that he brought him home under the wire, riding with one hand and waving to the crowd with the other. That style. Now, I wish, since I can show you pictures of the 2 horses, that I could show you a picture of the jockey, and I can't. But his name was Abe Hawkins. And we know that in the 1850s, when he was sort of at the very height of his career, he was considered probably one of the best two jockeys in America. The other one was Gilbert Patrick, who had ridden Lexington. And he came along at a very important time for sports celebrity for jockeys, in part because before the 1850s, jockeys are usually considered just, the guy who's along for the ride. Get a kid, skinny, short. Yeah, tie him on there. It'll be fine. Go, go. And at this point, jockeys come to be seen more as technicians and experts, and they have a role to play. And so sports reporting starts to sort of acknowledge who they are and follow them as well as following their horses. And the other thing that's happening more broadly in sports reporting that he, I think, really benefits from is that until the time of the telegraph, right, just getting the really basic information about what had happened in a sports event was a big deal. It took a long time. And if you're like me and you research this stuff all the time, there's some hilarious diary entries from planters in Louisiana who had put money on races in Kentucky in the 1830s and are like standing outside their doors for months waiting to find out, if you're coming by, hey, listen, did you happen to, I'm waiting on my money from my friend, But once the telegraph comes, you can have access to that information in seconds. And so sports writers no longer get a scoop just if they can tell you what happened. They have to be able to tell you a story, right? They need a character. There has to be drama. There has to be a narrative. There have to be for and against, and so they're looking around for sort of the first modern sports heroes as we would understand them. And Abe Hawkins really sort of qualifies as one. And so in newspapers across America, he's often the only jockey who's identified in a write-up. Sometimes he wins, sometimes he loses, but he's usually mentioned. And I love to collect the adjectives the magazines used on him. He was famous. 2 months later in the same magazine, he was world-renowned. They called him the dark necromancer of the equestrian art. He was, I'd love to be called that. They talked a lot about, how cool and level-headed he was, how good he was in dangerous situations, all this stuff. So he was a hero. Here's the other thing he was. He was an enslaved person. And he was not unique in that regard. Most of the men who were doing the expert labor of dealing with racehorses in the South before the Civil War are enslaved. Even if you just look at the Great Post Stakes, it is the beneficiary of a tremendous amount of black equestrian experience. The first man to train Lexington was a formerly enslaved man named Harry Lewis. LaCount's trainer was an enslaved man named Hark West. The assistant trainer who brought LaCount to the post was a very highly skilled technician named Anthony Hamilton, who was an enslaved man. So it wasn't like Abe was alone, but he was probably the most famous nationally of these guys. And I studied this for a long time, and something kept confusing me. And it was, I couldn't understand, given the context of the time, why nobody looked at the fact that this enslaved man was a national celebrity and saw that as a threat to slavery. I didn't understand how on earth that computed. And, if you'll excuse me, I'll take you back to the 11th grade for a moment and remind you that 1854 is the year of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the second party system has crumbled under the weight of slavery. Southerners are alert constantly to what they perceive to be threats to slavery. They've said again and again they're willing to go to war over this, and spoilers, they will. But and I thought, this is the time when everybody is just at flashpoint, and you're telling me that having an enslaved man described as the best at his job in America, regardless of race, that this is somehow not a threat? I just really didn't get it. And I finally got it when I found this table, which is from a national sports magazine. And the whole point is really that they were very excited about the post stakes, and they thought that it would be really good for the sport and the industry, and it was going to pump a lot of money in. And so here are all these high prices that have been refused for these horses or paid for these horses. So LaCount is on this list, Lexington is on this list, several others. And at the bottom of this list is Abe. And I think in order to understand the world these people lived in, you have to understand a world in which to them it seemed completely logical that you could celebrate someone and admire him and treat him as an expert. And you could still put him in a list with animals with a price next to his name. That is, in fact, the system that they were embedded in. So what was it actually like to be Abe Hawkins and to be an enslaved horseman? Well, it was in some ways very different from being an ordinary slave, in part because, first of all, you did very specialized labor, and so you were not often in the field, for instance, and so also you were not, they needed you. Right? Abe Hawkins, there wasn't somebody who could replace Abe Hawkins in 5 minutes. He was a specialist. So it was less likely that somebody like Abe Hawkins was going to experience really gross, immediate physical violence, which was important. But Frederick Douglass, for instance, who knew a lot of enslaved horsemen, said that he, as a regular field hand, had no desire to trade his life for theirs, because he said theirs had its own serious perils. First of all, that they were working very closely with white men who were really invested in what they were doing, and that meant that their job could be dangerous. And also that there were particular physical dangers and punishments that were associated with being a jockey that were really grotesque. And just to sort of give you some context, which is important for the whole lecture, jockey weights were lower then. So if you wanted to ride the whole card, right, if you wanted to ride 2-year-olds, if you wanted to ride any horse that an owner wanted you to be able to ride, you had to be able to tip the scales with your saddle at 90 pounds. And that meant, and I think to me this is one of the really remarkable examples of what it means to have someone else own your body, right? I mean, it's hard enough, we know, for present-day jockeys to get their weight down. But if you're enslaved, you don't own your body. So the person who owns your body can say to you, your body is going to look and weigh exactly how I want it. You're just not going to eat or drink until that happens. So there's that. Very popularly, the way they handled it, and this was done across the South, was they would bury jockeys up to the neck in the manure pile as a sort of, and the pounds steamed off, right? And of course, that also caused dehydration and all kinds of terrible nutrient loss, and it was extremely, extremely bad for you. That may, in fact, be why Abe Hawkins grew up to be, even when he's a grown man, he's the size of a child. And we think that's probably because he had very early malnutrition. But often, horsemen do have different privileges. They can move much more freely than other slaves. Sometimes, guys lay bets down and they're happy about it, so they give them some money. They can keep that. Some enslaved horsemen who were married had their marriages paid a good deal more respect than was common. And those are important, but it's also important to remember, I think, that in a circumstance where I think it felt like they couldn't necessarily govern somebody like Abe Hawkins with physical violence, it might be easier to instead say, hey, you have a little bit of money, your family's secure, what happens if we take that away? And that's a very easy way to get somebody to do what you want them to do, right? You give them something that's important to them, and then you threaten them with losing it. And that was a very well-regarded and well-established way of manipulating enslaved people. And I think that often did happen to enslaved horsemen. Now, the other thing that those privileges did, of course, was they separated them from their communities. It was made very clear to them that they were distinct, they were different. And their privileges did not extend to their families, they did not extend to their neighbors. And so they could be as successful as they wanted to be. And it was never going to matter for them or for the system as a whole. And that was very successful in terms of how slavery was able to operate very powerfully in the South. And indeed, in 1861, when the New Orleans races are run as a benefit for Southern soldiers and their families, Abe Hawkins wrote a bunch of winners. But by 1862, things had changed. And we know they changed because Duncan Kenner's plantation at Ashland was raided by the Yankees. And they confiscated his horses, who were ultimately sold at public auction in New York. And there was one horse that he had who was very talented, but also nuts. And the only thoroughbred ever who's nuts. But it was virtually impossible to get him out of the stall. And famously, I mean, everybody in America basically knew this if you were a fan, the guy who could deal with him was Abe Hawkins. And Abe Hawkins, as far as we know in all the accounts we have of this incident, was not there. We don't know where he was. There were other horsemen who were there. Some of them were his friends. But he wasn't around. And we don't know if that means that he had escaped previously, if he escaped in the confusion here, or if he was just absent. But he disappears from the record, and he doesn't appear again until the races at St. Louis in 1864. So I'm guessing he went up the river sometime in those 2 years. And he appears at St. Louis basically as a rock star, right? He's riding all these races. All these people who've never seen him before are so excited to see him. Robert Alexander, who owned Lexington and was the sort of foremost breeder of American thoroughbreds at the time, said that he'd just come back from Europe and they didn't have any jockeys in Europe that were anywhere near as good as Abe Hawkins. And later that summer, he goes on to ride the Travers Stakes at Saratoga. He's going to be on the opening card at Jerome Park in New York when high stakes racing really takes over New York. So Abe Hawkins actually made this remarkable transition to a new racing world that was mostly going to be headquartered in the Northeast and that was going to be staffed by free men, many free men of color. But he's doing something that, to me, seems even more significant than what he's doing personally for himself or for his sport. He's also one of the most famous black men in America. And he is demonstrating, by being a famous black man who's going around living his life, what it might look like if black people were free, what it might look like if they were equal. And my students will tell you that once we start talking about Reconstruction, I lose my mind completely, so I apologize, but I just think this is so fascinating, okay? So we rewrote the Constitution. In 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified, and it says slavery is abolished. In 1868, the 14th Amendment is ratified, and it says everyone is guaranteed equal protection of the laws. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified, and it says black men can vote. That's great. It doesn't mean anything unless regular people go out in the world and they try to test the boundaries of that, right? They try to figure out what it means to be equal and what it means to be free. And sometimes that means that even in really mundane situations, revolutionary change is occurring. And Abe Hawkins is actually one of my favorite examples of that, because in 1866, he's at the track in New Jersey, and this reporter is doing this story about all the celebrities that he's run into at the track in New Jersey. And he's sort of, oh, I ran into so-and-so and so-and-so. Oh, yeah, and then I ran into Abe Hawkins, the famous jockey, and, we said hello, and we shook hands, and then, I kept going, and he kept going, whatever. That's completely mundane. But Abe Hawkins had worked with white men for his entire life. White men had cheered for him for decades. That's the first record we have of a white man sticking his hand out and saying, friend, colleague, let's shake hands. That's a new world, right? That's a world where equality might be a thing. And unfortunately, Abe Hawkins died late in the 1860s, so he did not have very much opportunity to experience that new world. But he left behind this younger generation of black horsemen, most of whom were born during the Civil War, many of whom are very successful at New Orleans. So that includes people like Pike Barnes, Tony Hamilton, Monk Overton, Tommy Britton, James Perkins, and Isaac Murphy. And Murphy is usually regarded as the most famous African-American jockey. He's sometimes posited as the greatest American jockey of all time. His winning percentage is still the best. And these guys are in a moment where in the 1870s and the 1880s, they constitute this critical mass of black athletes in a major American sport in a way that draws public attention, in a way that I think is new. It's not just that there's, one or two black men who are successful. It's that a significant percentage of the people competing at the most elite level are black. So just as a metric, in the first 25 Kentucky Derbies, about half of them are won by black men. And the response to that from fans is significant. So, for instance, these guys are making a lot of money. Murphy was making the equivalent today of millions of dollars. When they remodeled their houses or they had parties, it was like celebrity gossip. It was in the papers. And black fans paid a lot of attention to this. These guys are all over the black press. They are examples of African American achievement. But white fans are paying attention too, and we have white memoirists who say they remember when they were kids and all the little boys in their neighborhood wanted to grow up and be Isaac Murphy. And I was having a conversation about this with another historian friend of mine who's also a sports junkie, and I said, when do you think the next time was that a white child went home and told his father he wanted to be a black athlete when he grew up? And I said, I'm thinking it might be Joe Louis or Jackie Robinson. So that's 50 years. And he said, I don't think it was then. I think it's Bo Jackson or Michael Jordan. And that's almost 100 years. Actually, that is 100 years. So, you can see how revolutionary this was, right? Because that's really a colorblind society where your kid can look at his sports hero and say, wow, I want to be him, right? And race doesn't occur to him. And that was a major revolution. That was a revolution. A revolution was happening at the racetrack. And black fans knew it, which is why it was very important to them to go. And so you can see, for instance, when Louisiana tracks began trying to institute segregation in the 1870s, black fans immediately file suit in New Orleans. And they say, no, we want equal access to these facilities. And in black newspapers, you get responses to this where editorial writers say, look, we understand, some people are not super into the track, we get it, but this is not what this is about, right? It should be remembered that cases of this kind are not personal issues, but that in a correct solution of them lies the settlement of the question of civil rights, which is a matter of vital importance to every colored man in the state of Louisiana. I think it took longer for white fans to sort of figure out what was at stake, but they did. They figured it out. And there's a significant backlash as a result. And one of my sort of go-to examples of that is a set of sports columns that began circulating throughout the South towards the end of the 1890s. And the sports writer is talking about how he used to love going to the track, and now he hates it. And he says, look, don't get me wrong. I'm fine with black jockeys, no problem. I love them. It's black fans. I hate black fans. And he said, I hate black fans because they act like if black jockeys are successful, I'm supposed to treat them differently. Like what black jockeys accomplish means something about their position. And I hate that. And he said, all I do is I stand at the track and I look around at those crowds and I think about the 15th Amendment. And I think these people can vote. So by the end of the 19th century, everybody could see that the racetrack was both this huge sport that absorbed the passions of all kinds of people, but it was also this little microcosmic view of what America might look like if white and black men were competing equally in an integrated environment, and if their communities were getting the benefit of their labor and their celebrity. And the end of Isaac Murphy's career, I think, is a really good, it's actually very sad, but it's a very accurate marker, I think, of how all this really was given a great deal of meaning. So in summer of 1890, Murphy's really at the height of his power, which was saying something because Gilbert Patrick always said that Isaac Murphy, he thought, was the reincarnation of Abe Hawkins. And Murphy had ridden one of the first photo finishes in America that summer. And in response to that, the biggest black newspaper in the country put him on the front page. And the editor interviewed him. And he said, I understand that there are a lot of people who, who don't necessarily approve of racing, religious people probably, but he said, listen, you need to get over that. Because this man is the best. And he is the example in his refusal to accept loss, in his refusal to be treated with less than dignity. This man is the example for all kinds of civil rights activism. Now, this is the editor, T. Thomas Fortune, who actually himself was not a racing fan and in fact had to be bailed out of jail because he had started sit-ins. He was the guy who invented sit-ins, and he was sitting in at New York hotel lobbies that summer getting equal access to public facilities. And he actually took a break to go to the track to see Isaac Murphy because he believed that Isaac Murphy was a symbol of this kind of civil rights activism. And so he puts this on the front page of his newspaper. And a week later, Isaac Murphy was accused of being drunk on the job, and his career never recovered. I've discussed this with all kinds of people who study this. We've all looked at the evidence, what there is of it. We do not believe that there is any kind of conclusive evidence that he was drunk. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests he was not. And probably the best explanation is that, like many jockeys of his era, he was in terrible physical health, especially because as he got older, he was probably flip-flopping about 50 pounds a year in order to ride. So, 6 months of the year, he weighed about 140 pounds, and then within about a month, he was losing 50 pounds in order to get down to 90, and then struggling to stay there, and then rocketing back up. And we think that just caused fundamental physical debility that caught up to him sometimes. But as I say, his career never recovered. And he died very young. He died at the age of 35 of heart failure, again, probably because there was just so much mileage on his body from having done that to himself. And 2 months after he died, in the spring of 1896, the Supreme Court handed down Plessy versus Ferguson, which, as we know, starts with this man, Homer Plessy, being pulled off a train not very far from here because he, as a mixed-race person, wanted to ride in the white coach. And the Supreme Court would declare that the segregation laws of the state of Louisiana were constitutional, that they did not violate the 14th Amendment, and separate but equal became the law of the land. Now, there's a very famous dissent in Plessy, as I'm sure many of you know. And that dissent was written by John Marshall Harlan of Kentucky, who was himself a racing fan. If you go back to 19th century America, everybody was a racing fan, just accept it. Like, they're all crazy about it. And John Marshall Harlan's father had freed, we think, this is a little confusing, but had freed a man who had belonged to their family, who took the name Robert Harlan. This is Robert Harlan. And Robert Harlan had moved from, once he was free, had moved from Kentucky to California and then to Ohio and had made a good bit of money in the real estate business. And he took that money and he bought thoroughbreds. And he became a very prominent thoroughbred owner. In fact, he was one of the first American owners to bring thoroughbreds to Great Britain. And it was only in the 1890s that Robert Harlan began being denied access to racetracks on the basis of his race. And I have no idea if John Marshall Harlan knew about that. They were certainly acquainted, but I have no idea if they discussed this. But to me, it seems significant that the man who wrote the dissent in Plessy knew someone who had felt the pain of segregation personally. And that context of black men being locked out of the racetrack, to me, is always part of how I read Justice Harlan's, some of his language. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and equality established before the law and the Constitution, and it cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. The thin disguise of separate but equal accommodation will not mislead anyone, nor will it ever atone for the wrong that is done this day. Now, Jim Crow came to the racetrack, but the doors didn't close immediately. So that's John Marshall Harlan, just so you know. This is Jimmy Lee, who was born in Raceland and who broke in on the tracks in New Orleans. And in 1907, he would go to Churchill Downs and win every race on the card one afternoon. And the newspapers interviewed him, and he said his ambition in life was to be the next Isaac Murphy. And he looked like he could be. He was very talented. But he had come along at the Jim Crow moment. And what had happened, basically, was that white jockeys, for the first time in 200 years of competing with black men without saying anything about it, that we have any record of, suddenly said they didn't want to do that anymore. And they threatened black jockeys, they threatened owners, and they actively ganged up on black jockeys in competition. So there's a famous incident, for instance, in Chicago, where Jimmy Wingfield, who had won the Kentucky Derby, actually sustained a fractured skull because white jockeys ran their horses into his and threw the horse over the fence. And he came off the horse and hit himself in the head. Don't worry, Jimmy came back, and he didn't die till 1976. He also rode 3,000 winners in Europe before he was done. But that was going on, and everybody knew it. And we know that Jimmy Lee got caught up in that because in the spring of 1908 at the New Orleans races, he got into a fight with a bunch of white jockeys outside the St. Charles Hotel. And it made the papers because he grabbed the shirt of one of those guys and told him that they were to stop doing that he was not going to put up with that. And the newspapers interviewed the white jockeys, and they said, "What's going on here?" And the white jockey said, "Well, Lee is definitely the best jockey we have ever seen, but he's black, so we don't want to ride against him. So that's it. We're done." And that actually seems to have been, to some degree, the death knell of Jimmy Lee's career. He went to Canada for a while, really couldn't sustain it, and racing publications actually began blaming him. And they said his problem is that he thinks that white jockeys might attack him or threaten him. It's all in his head. It's so sad that he's so delusional. This is actually, sadly, pretty typical of the coverage of this problem. Some of it is truly remarkable, especially because you're like, this is racing coverage in newspapers that have been covering this for decades. They know what they're talking about, and they know that what they are saying is nonsense, and yet they continue saying it. And one of my favorite examples of this is a story in the Washington Post where the Washington Post says, there really don't seem to be black jockeys the way they're used to. It's kind of amazing. We've really thought about it, and we've concluded the only possible explanation is science. Because evolutionary science says that you cannot have black men and white men working in a barn together. And I thought everybody in America knew that black men and white men had been working in barns together since the founding. There was overwhelming data that said this was nonsense. And yet their response to it was to say, they're inferior, so just scientifically they get driven out. But in fact, of course, what was happening was that black men were not being hired for the jobs they'd been hired for. They weren't getting the promotions they'd gotten. They, in turn, weren't hiring young black men. And so, really, what happens is, in many cases, people's careers never get started, or in the cases of people like Jimmy Lee and many of the others who had had a chance, really, to make a good living and to be community heroes, that got foreclosed. And it got foreclosed right sort of at the height of their powers. And the consequences of that personally for some of those folks were really devastating. And I spent several months of my life following them through obituary notices and crime reports and finding out the consequences of that to their lives. And the example I'll cite here is of Tom Britton, who was a very successful jockey at New Orleans and nationally, who no longer was able to get a job and could not support his wife and his beloved child. And so he rented a hotel room and he drank carbolic acid. And when they found his body, they found his suicide note that he had written to his wife. And he told her that he loved her more than anything in the world and that he knew he would never see her again because he knew that he was committing suicide and so he would never go to heaven. But it's important to remember that even after all that tragedy, black men continued to work on tracks and to be successful on tracks and to contribute in really, really significant ways to racing in the United States. And they did that nowhere more frequently than in New Orleans, which has always fostered a community of black horsemen. And so, yes, it has been since 1902, since a black man won the Kentucky Derby. Jimmy Winkfield won in 1902. We're still waiting for another. No black man had ridden in the Kentucky Derby since 1920 until 2000, when Marlon St. Julien, who broke in at the fairgrounds, rode Carroul for Godolphin, which was a major mount to get. And Marlon has retired, unfortunately, so I don't think he's going to be the one who breaks the streak. But my hope is that the black man we're going to see in the winner's circle of the Kentucky Derby before his career is over is Kendrick Carmouche. Kendrick, who is pictured here on one of the tracks in New York, riding for, I think he's riding for Wesley Ward in this picture, but he often also rides for Chad Brown. And if you are a racing dork like me, you know that those are extremely, extremely major trainers who have huge winners, not only in the United States, but abroad. And Kendrick is the son of the noted Louisiana jockey Sylvester Carmouche, popularly known as the Fog Jockey, which is because he once hit a horse in a fog bank at Louisiana Downs and just sneaked in the front right before they passed the finish line. Kendrick evidently says it's a relief to live in New York and not have people ask him if he's that Carmouche. But he's been riding professionally since he was 16 years old. And everyone, I think, is very hopeful that he will, in the end, be the African-American rider who wins the next Kentucky Derby for black Americans. They interviewed his father about it, and they said, why are you hopeful? And his father said that he had said something very simple to him. I told him he can go anywhere and he can do anything. He's a good rider because of where he comes from. And I think when Sylvester Carmouche says that, he's talking not only about this long history of great racing in South Louisiana and in New Orleans, but also about the long history of black men contributing to the sport in this area, and also contributing to the long struggle in the United States for a free and equal society.